Hello, grammar students. We have to keep on working with subordinate clauses. We have already talked about noun clauses and adverbial clauses. So now let's move on to the third kind, to relative clauses. Relative clauses are classified into restrictive and non-restrictive relative clauses. Or maybe you can find the name defining and non-defining relative clauses, and even identifying, non-identifying relative clauses. Okay, this is a very important distinction. Have a look at the two sentences, all right, the two sentences you have here. The first one reads, my daughter who is living in Mexico is 19 years old. The other one, my daughter, who is living in Mexico, is 19 years old. They look alike, I agree, but they are quite different in terms of what they mean. Relative clauses may serve different purposes. If you look at the first example, and let me tell you, that is an example of a restrictive relative clause. The user chooses a relative clause to restrict the meaning of the noun it is attached to. In this particular case, daughter. I decide to use this relative clause to define who I'm talking about, to specify which of my daughters I'm talking about, okay? So if you use the first, probably that is because you have more than one daughter. Imagine I had two daughters. So I could say, my daughter who's living in Mexico is 19 years old. And that means my daughter who lives with me is older. That's why it is called a restrictive relative clause, because it restricts the scope of the noun it is related to. In the second case, my daughter, who's living in Mexico, is 19 years old. My daughter is already enough to know who I am talking about. You don't know me so well, but if you knew me, you would know that I only have one daughter. So if I say my daughter, that's it. It can't be but Emilia, okay? That's her name. So be careful when you read explanations, because sometimes it says it is the non-defining relative clause is additional information, extra information. Okay, be careful. It is additional in the sense that it is not necessary to identify the noun in question, okay? So, where are our relative clauses? The first one, this is the restrictive relative clause in the first example, and you have a non-restrictive relative clause in the second example. All right? Now, let me tell you that relative clauses are very frequently used because they help us join two sentences into one. Probably if you remember, I don't know, when you first heard about the relative clauses, most probably the exercise you did was joining sentences. Which are the two sentences involved in the first case? Well, in both cases, really. On the one hand, my daughter is 19 years old, and then she's living in Mexico, okay? So from two sentences, you can make one by using a relative clause. As I said before, relative clauses are related to a noun, closely related to a noun. In fact, I think we said this before, the only possible function of a relative clause is, this is good news because there's only one, post modifier of a head noun within a noun phrase. Let's identify the boundaries of the noun phrase in the first example. In the first example, my daughter who is living in Mexico, I'm going to underline, is a noun phrase, okay? It is a noun phrase subject. And inside, you have the head daughter and the post modifier restrictive relative clause, who is living in Mexico. And the same, in the second example, you also have the noun phrase, my daughter, who is living in Mexico. All right. These are explanation is related to the difference in meaning. You see that in writing you will find commas in the case of non-defining relative clauses, and in speech the pauses. All right, a very peculiar intonation when producing a non-restrictive relative clause. As regards the use of relatives, and then we'll classify them, you know that, which is a relative pronoun, you have it here, can only be used in the case of defining relative clauses. And the possibility of omitting the relative is also restricted to relative clauses. Let's have a look at the relative words, which I have sub-classified here. We can talk about relative pronouns. Relative pronouns, who, which, and that. You know, we use the relative pronoun who for human antecedents, which for non-human antecedents. When I say antecedent, I'm referring to the noun the clause is post-modifying, and you can use that for both human and non-human antecedents. Let's have a look at some examples I copied here for you. She still remembers the face of the man who robbed her last year. Can you identify the relative clause here? Yes, this, who robbed her last year, is our relative clause. As I said before, this relative clause appears within the boundaries of a noun phrase, is part of a noun phrase, which is the noun phrase here, this one I'm going to underline, sorry, not of. The underlined noun phrase, the man who robbed her last year, is the noun phrase object to the preposition of. And inside you find a defining relative clause. And as I said before, this comes from two sentences. She still remembers the face of the man, and the man robbed her last year. Here you have an example using who. Then you have an example using which. The ring which he stole was very valuable. The relative which he stole, and the noun phrase that contains this clause is the ring which he stole, which is the subject of this sentence. Now let's look at that. Is it possible to use that in any of these cases? Of course. In fact, I can use, that in both cases. She still remembers the face of the man that robbed her, or the ring that he stole was very valuable. Now, what about the omission? I'll use a 0 here. What about the omission? Is it possible to say the ring he stole was very valuable? What do you think? The ring he stole was very valuable. Yes, of course, this is a possibility in this example. Now, what about the previous example? Is it okay if we say she still remembers the face of the man robbed her last year? No, incorrect. Why? Because if you look at the relative pronoun, either who or that, the one we are using, the relative pronoun within the structure of the clause is the subject, okay? Who robbed? Who is a relative pronoun subject. So you cannot omit the subject. You can omit the relative when it performs a function other than subject, as is the case here because the subject for the verb stole would be he, and which would be the direct object. He stole which. Okay? All right, let's move on. There is another relative pronoun which is more formal, and that's why it is not so frequently used. Look at this example. The woman whom my cousin married is a lawyer. Where is the relative clause? Here, whom my cousin married, and it is within this noun phrase, which is a subject, okay? Is this sentence grammatically correct? Of course. When can we use whom? Whom is the objective form of who. What does it mean? That you can use whom when this relative is an object, not when it is a subject. Who is the subjective form and whom is the objective form. Who is equivalent to I, the personal pronoun, the subjective form. Whom would be equivalent to me, the objective form of the pronoun. When do we use me? After verbs and prepositions. And the same happens with whom. Whom is used after verbs as an object and prepositions. Okay, so in this case, if you look at whom, it would be the object to the verb married. My cousin married whom. Now, is this a very common example? Well, in fact, it's a bit too formal because there are other alternatives which are less formal. I could say the woman who my cousin married is a lawyer, and that would be perfect. I could even say that the woman that my cousin married, and I think the most common would be the woman my cousin married is a lawyer. Okay? So we usually use some other relative pronoun. The only case where whom is not optional, let's say, is when it comes immediately after a preposition. For example, if I say the teacher, the teacher for whom I wrote this is absent today. Okay. This essay could be. The teacher for whom I wrote this is absent today. Which is the relative clause here? For whom I wrote this. This is the noun phrase, the teacher for whom I wrote this. And here there is no other possibility. If you have for, what you cannot say for who, all right? You need for whom. But of course there are other alternatives because most people will go for something like the teacher who I wrote this for, that I wrote this for, and in the end this would could end as the teacher I wrote this for is absent today. Look at how flexible these structures are, right? The teacher I wrote this for is absent today. Here is the relative with the omission, okay, of the relative pronoun. So sometimes it is not so easy to identify the relative clauses when the relative pronoun is omitted. Okay, let's move on. Up to now, we talked about relative pronouns, who, which, that, whom, and the omission. But there is also a relative determiner. You know what a determiner is. When I say determiner, you should immediately think of a word that precedes a noun. That is, after a determiner, you will always find a noun. As in my example here, the people whose houses were destroyed during the fire will spend the night at the local church. You see that immediately after whose you find the noun houses. Let's see the relative, whose houses were destroyed during the fire. This is our defining relative clause here, which is within this noun phrase I'm underlining, okay? Subject in this case. So whenever you use whose, you need whose house, whose daughter, whose plus noun. And then last, you will have relative adverbs, okay? Relative adverbs. When, where, and why. When related to place. That was the day when, there's a missing subject, when we last met. Or where related to place. I would love to go back to the town where I was born. Or I don't know the reason why you're here. Okay, let's mark which are the relative clauses here. When we last met, this is the relative, and this is the noun phrase where you find the relative. Where I was born, where I was born is the other relative, and why you're here is the other relative. And let's underline the noun phrases where they are included here. Okay. Now, well, as I said before, you should remember that in the case of non-restrictive relative clauses, you cannot omit the relative, you cannot use that, and so you have to use the other relative words. When we start practicing, you will see that we use relative clauses all the time, and sometimes we don't even know we are using them, but they are really, really useful. Well, I hope this has been useful. Feel free to ask questions as usual. Thank you for listening.